I'm Chris Cristido.
And I'm Rasa Serrero, and today we have Austin Landrette presenting his master's thesis.
What's going on, guys?
What's going on? Welcome back, man.
So tell us, what does your thesis studio focused on?
We didn't have a really specific focus. Our professor instructed us to really take the opportunity to explore whatever we wanted.
Okay. And what exactly was it that you wanted?
For me, I wanted to focus on something that was like you could imagine, like it was gonna be used by some kind of nonprofit organization, something to help refugees. That was gonna be my focus.
Okay, sounds like a powerful topic, man.
Great.
So, and I titled it The Sahara Refuge, and I had this kind of quote here, trying to translate fine-grained desert sand into a viable building material. This could open up the possibility for contemporary settlement dedicated to displaced peoples of the Sahara Desert. So that was, after I kind of refined the idea, that's what it really turned into. So I started kind of looking at the displaced peoples. You have this kind of global map that lays out the spread around the world. I think it starts to really cluster in the global south. It's like this term that focuses on developing countries, basically. And I looked at how many people are being accepted into the developed nations. So you look at the numbers here, United States letting in, there are about 30,000 people. And on the next slide, I looked at how many people were applying. So how influential are these numbers really being? If you look at Germany, they're only letting in 3,000 people in 2017, but they had over 100,000 people apply. So I think there was this kind of gap where the developing world really wasn't picking up the slack, I guess you could say. So I decided to focus on the Sahara Desert specifically because I noticed there was a large number of internally displaced persons, which is basically a refugee that they're trapped in their country. They can't escape. They would like to, obviously, but they're stuck there in their nation. And you kind of get this glimpse of what the conditions are like there. I talked about kind of how the average person really wouldn't be able to last here. We can imagine these types of conditions, but for those people that are living there, they still have this kind of sense of optimism. You know, they're looking to make their lives better, even though they're in these tough conditions. And then I looked at life in the Sahara, so ways that people really adapt to these environments. There's these wind catchers. They're really actually like an ancient technology. And I did this diagram here on the left that kind of illustrates how they work. They can draw in hot air, bring it underground, cool it, and then that brings it back up into the structure. And it also kind of creates natural cross ventilation through the tower. So this ended up being a form that I tried to emulate. Like at the primitive structures, how they're kind of focused, they just, these are built with mud and straw to kind of hold it together. And this is actually a contemporary settlement in the Sahara. So they figured out ways to kind of have like a sustainable crop system there, which was really surprising to me because when you think about the Sahara Desert, it's like a wasteland. I couldn't imagine anything to grow there. But obviously it can be done. I looked at kind of these cultural things, kind of focus on craft, those communities. So you see pottery, they go into dye production for textiles, things like that. And these often can, maybe not often, but they can grow into businesses that support small communities. So this Ocean Soul Africa, he takes these flip-flops, they'll wash up on the beach, and he'll be able to kind of carve them into sculptures, and that turned into a business. He sold them online. He got a lot of people involved, so now the community helps him make these sculptures, collect flip-flops, and kind of this entrepreneurial spirit there, I guess you could say. So I wanted to focus on like a sustainable material that you could use to create these settlements. And obviously in the Sahara Desert, that might be sand. That's the most abundant material there. And if you look at these primitive bricks, they'll use sand and this powdery substance called lime. And they'll mix that together and it'll create a pretty strong enough brick that can give you a simple structure. And that process has kind of been modernized. These factory productions you can see on the right. There's people researching ways to use it. I'd say the issue with desert you find in the Sahara is that it's too fine grained. So it can't really bind well together with any adhesive that you use. So it does take a little bit of research to try to figure out how to use it. These guys have gotten pretty far and I was trying to emulate their process. So I started making these little small samples. These ones here is just sand, water, and lime. And they hold together well. I ended up doing pressure tests with them to see how much weight they could support. And there's this kind of spectrum I set up here to show, if you're looking on the left, that's just sand, water, and lime. The second one in, I didn't use any water to kind of show how quickly, how essential that ingredient is. In the middle there is these kind of equal parts of sand and lime, which I found to be the most successful. And all the way to the right was when I started to incorporate cement, because if you're just using sand and lime and water, it can't cure. So if water hits it again, it's going to melt away. So that became like an essential thing to figure out, how do you get the sand material to cure? And in the meantime, I was just using cement as something to kind of keep the experiment moving forward. So I did these pressure tests. We had a hydraulic press at the studio, so I was able to use that. And even the sand and lime solutions, those actually were able to support more weight than I suspected. I think I didn't write it here, but at this gauge, you can kind of see it was getting up to a couple tons, if I'm reading it right. Yeah. So that was a shock to me. Some details of that. And I kind of broke it down. I think I explained this in depth a little bit during the presentation, but I'll kind of go over it now. So I looked at robotics and construction as a way to use this material, as a way to actually construct these settlements. I just looked at a lot of people who are kind of pushing this robotic construction forward. These contour crafting guys have these large industrial scale printers and manufacturers, so I have a lot of research going on in that. This is an Italian group actually that used robotic arms. They were able to produce this structure in only 7 days, so these can actually be put together pretty rapidly. And at a sufficient size, 100 square meters, that's enough for maybe a couple people or a small family. This is a Chinese company that was starting to 3D print houses, and they've gone actually really far. They're doing townhomes, whole communities in a few months. There's a lot of progress being made there. So I kind of broke it into two options for the plan, where you take this, the sand and whatever adhesive, you end up settling on, you combine that with on-site industrial scale fabrication, robotic fabrication, and then you have your shelters. Or you could fabricate these off-site in factories and segments, and then you use robotic construction to kind of put these prefabricated elements together on-site. So this was kind of the image that started to kind of reflect the settlement, something that could be robotically printed and start to create an environment where small ecosystems for landscaping and agriculture, craft can kind of be housed. Looked at kind of erection time, how long it would take to put these things together and at what different scales, kind of the plan. So if you can set up a couple cranes that are printing, you can kind of start to cover certain areas. I was looking at structurally how these things would work. If you're starting to incorporate different forms of arches, these can kind of come together to support these things. and then tying back to these wind catchers, trying to maintain the scale of them and how they work. So to show a few diagrams, at the bottom right, you can start to see how that cooled air is coming up through the ground and the hot air coming down and cooled through the towers. I was looking into different materials that are able to kind of absorb water from the air. So if you're obviously in the desert, water is an issue. If you have this air coming down, even though there's little humidity in it, you're still able to capture water, maybe store it at the bottom, start to create these reservoirs. I wanted to focus a little bit on how the scale of these things were, lining up with the scale of a home, scale of a person, and then just really quick diagrams of how these things could be laid out. So dedicating space for gathering, places of worship, education, living and sleeping, craft, things like that. If you start to scale it up, how these things can start to be formed. I think I finished up with just a few shots of how the community could work, and there was this one diagram here. This starts to explain how this thing can be sustained economically. So say you have foreign aid from the developed nations coming to the nations that may need support. They can then distribute that to relief organizations, and that could be distributed to the shelters. And at the shelters, they can use craft agriculture to raise money to support themselves and give back a percentage to the government. And I think that kind of incentivizes both sides to keep the system working. And I think that's where I ended with a couple shots of the settlement.
That's great work, man.
Yeah, man. I think you have a very powerful project. Kind of tackling this very delicate topic of helping out refugees and thinking of formulating a way to create housing for them, something that, like you said, like the high-end countries of the world are kind of turning a cold shoulder to, and your whole business plan and the level of research and quality of research, especially for an educational project, I think it's magnificent to see.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
I mean, you spoke on the initial interview that we had with you about how your initial focus or your focus and end goal within architecture was kind of based in like a community, and like I guess kind of culminated to like a similar urban planning idea, and it really shows in your thesis, man. I think from the research, like Ramsey said, to cultural elements to understanding really how to lay out a living, working, breathing, I guess, environment for a completely different culture than what you're used to is something that's very nice to see, man. It's really great work.
Right. And I think that's a good point, though. I think it's something you could bring against it, is this kind of cultural influence over there that might not be yet understood. And I think it's important, people from the outside to really consider that carefully when they're bringing these outside influences in.
Yeah. I think what you're doing, the fact that you're bringing in modern technologies, but still maintaining these customs that a lot of these countries have, that some of the world might see as primitive or as very hasn't altered in decades and centuries. I think it's a beautiful mixture between, like I said, modern technologies and kind of like old customs.
Right.
And I think this project does a great job at showcasing how successful that can be. But thank you, man. Thank you for sharing with us. And I hope anyone that's currently in architecture school or thinking about doing their thesis can look at this project as an example of a viable option and a very strong subject to study, and trying to see if they can find a different solution.
Thank you, man. We appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Anytime.